come together to, as brothers and sisters in Christ, to share a common love for Thee. We're thankful for the good night's rest, and we're thankful for the moisture that we've received thus far, and we recognize that all good things come from Thee. We're thankful, Father, that we can study Thy Word without fear of persecution. We ask that You be with us till we open our hearts to receive the truth, and nothing but the truth, and have a better understanding of those things You expect us to do as Your children. We ask, Father, that You'd be with our sister Leanne Colvin as she undergoes surgery today, that it might be a successful surgery and she might have a speedy recovery. And we ask also, Father, that You'd be with our sister Beth Arnhart as she undergoes surgery tomorrow. We ask that You'd be with our sister Maxine Life and her sister and brother-in-law, that they might have a speedy recovery from their illness and be able to return to Thy service as You would have them do so. We ask, Father, that You'd help us that we might always look out for those of our members, to help them in any way that we can when there is need from us. We ask, Father, that You'd be with John this morning as he directs our minds in the study of Nehemiah, that he might have a ready recollection of those things he studied, and help each one of us that we might participate fully and give You the praise and the glory. These things we ask in Jesus Christ's holy name. Amen.
Amen. Okay. Let's go ahead and do the questions for chapter 4. Left off with last week. Get myself resituated up here. There we go. All right, question number 1 of chapter 4 is, how did Sanballat react when he learned the Jews were rebuilding the wall?
Very furious.
Exactly. Furious. That's right. And even mocked them. Number 2, who said, whatever they build, if even a fox goes upon it, he will break their stone wall down? Tobiah, the Ammonite. Number 3, why did the Jews set a watch against him day and night? Yeah, because of the conspiracy of Sanballat, Tobiah, and the others there. They were trying to prevent them from building the wall, so they set a watch against them. Question number 4, who said, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, great and awesome, and fight for your brethren. Nehemiah did. Number 5, according to verse 17, how did people work on the wall and carry their burdens?
They worked one hand and held a weapon in the other.
Yeah, exactly. They in other words, they were prepared to fight, prepared to defend themselves as need be. Number 6, what were the people to do if they heard the sound of the trumpet? Rally to that sound. It was kind of a call, and they were to head towards that sound of the trumpet to help defend that area. Number 7, who did Nehemiah say would fight for us? God, exactly. And then number 8, so neither I, my blank, my servants, nor the men of the guard who followed me took off our clothes, except that everyone took them off for washing. Exactly. So young people, imagine if your parents said, look, we're going to be so busy this week, you cannot take your clothes off, you can't change clothes, except to wash. This is what they did, so they would always be ready and their guard would not be let down. And yes, we do have several young people with us today due to this being spring break in our area. And so I'm glad they're able to be here. We are looking at Nehemiah, and this morning we're going to be starting in Nehemiah chapter 5. Nehemiah chapter 5. We do put the verses up here on the screen, but if you'd like to follow along in your Bibles, that would be acceptable as well. Okay, as we get into this particular area here, Nehemiah discovers a problem amongst the people there. And we'll see the very first verse here in a minute. We'll read this. There was a great outcry of the people. And what we're about to look at in this first section here is a situation that the law of Moses pretty much said you don't do. You don't treat your brethren this way. But because of the high taxes of the Persian Empire of the day, the taxes that they had to pay to the local government and everything, people were just running out of money. And it's in essence, they were having to borrow the funds in order to pay these taxes. And as a result, you had people charging interest and basically treating one another in such a way that was not allowed by the Mosaical law there. So let's start here in Nehemiah chapter 1. And Dale, would you read for us there in Nehemiah chapter 5, beginning in verse 1 there. And let's read down to verse 5 as we look at this.
And there was a great outcry of the people and their wives against their Jewish brethren. For there were those who said, We, our sons and our daughters, are many. Therefore let us get grain that we may eat and live. There were also some who said, We have mortgaged our lands and vineyards and houses that we might buy grain because of the famine. There were also those who said, We have borrowed money for the king's tax on our lands and vineyards. Yet now our flesh is as the flesh of our brethren, our children as their children, and indeed we are forcing our sons and our daughters to be slaves. And some of our daughters have been brought into slavery. It is not in our power to redeem them, for other men have our lands and vineyards.
Okay. Let's go back up to verse 1 here now and kind of talk about the situation that had developed among the people there. You notice that he says there in the beginning of this verse 1 that there was a great what that had come out from among the people there? Outcry. And you'll notice here what he says. There was a great outcry of the people and their wives against whom? The Jewish brethren, exactly. These we're not talking about being disgruntled against the representative of the Persian Empire. These were their own Jewish brethren, the way that they were treating them. And he'll get into specifics here in just a moment. Let's look there at verse 2. He says, For there were those who said, and here's their cry, We, our sons and our daughters, are many, so let us get grain that we may eat and live. Now that's reasonable. Okay, all they're wanting is so that they can eat and live. But look at verse 3. There were also some who said, We have mortgaged our lands and vineyards and houses that we might buy grain because of the famine. What is the idea behind mortgaging?
You loan against it.
Okay, pretty much it's like saying, we don't have enough money to buy this. So if you'll use our house as collateral, kind of, we'll buy this on credit. Well, the problem with mortgaging your house is that if you don't pay it back, what happens to your house? You'll lose your house, exactly. And the same thing, we've mortgaged our lands and vineyards and houses. Now, let's think back for just a moment. Think a long time back historically now. When was something, well, it's not quite similar, but there is a measure of similarity where this was done once before. And basically a whole nation of people came to be essentially owned by the leader of the country, or the Pharaoh of the nation. Well, I'll give you a big hint. Joseph. Yeah, you remember this with the situation of Joseph? They had collected grain for a large number of years. Okay, and in the collecting of the grain there, the people, what they would do is when it came time, they would come and they would sell the king, the Pharaoh, the property. And they would sell that in order to get the grain so that they might live. Well, in this is different though. Like I said, it's a little bit similar, but this is different. Because these are Jewish brethren, their own brethren who had money. It's essentially saying, here, we'll give you money so that you may eat and live, but you're going to have to mortgage your house, your vineyards, etc., etc. And this created a very difficult situation. And he talks about why in verse 4. Any thoughts or comments so far? All right, look at verse 4. He says, There were also those who said, We have borrowed money for the king's tax on our lands and vineyards. So, what was the reason that they were borrowing money? Was it simply for food?
Taxes.
Exactly, to pay the king's taxes. Because remember, let me bring this chart back up here. We've talked about this before. Let me drag it over there. There we go. Now, this right here is a kind of a rough map of the reign of the Persian Empire. And so, let me bring this down so everybody can see it. And let's see. There's Persia and Susa. Let's kind of focus on there. All right, so here, the pink area there is the reign of the Persian Empire. And everybody within this reign owed taxes to the king of Persia. Artaxerxes at this point, I believe it was. And so all the way over here in Damascus, the land beyond the river, they still had to pay the taxes. So on top of the taxes that had to be paid, there was also the food and clothing that they had to have. And then, not to mention, and we'll see this in the latter half of this chapter, they also had taxes that they were paying to the local governor, to the one who was set in charge of the local area. And we'll see Nehemiah takes a big step to ease the burden upon the people later on in this chapter. Any thoughts or comments?
My
Yes.
Bible has a footnote here where it says, the events of this chapter may have taken place during the 52 days of the wall. Is that
That's possible. I would almost suspect, though, that this was something that came to his attention after the building of the wall. But I can't say that for certain, though. Later, when we start there in verse, let's see. When you come down around verse 14 there, Nehemiah was governor in the land of Judah. So if he was serving as governor from the point that he got over there, then it could have all been within the same time period. And if he was appointed as governor after the walls were rebuilt, then it would have definitely been afterwards. But I don't know. That's a good point. I mean, that would almost add insult to injury on top of everything. You know, now they're having to mortgage their homes and everything just to live. They're not able to work their fields and so forth.
well, there's some more interesting stuff here about this.
Go ahead.
It says the events of this chapter may have taken place during 52 days of wall building. 3 reasons for the troublesome condition were given. The landless were without food. The landowners were forced to mortgage their land because of famine. And borrowing was necessary to pay a property tax imposed by the Persians for laws on the loans, pledges, and Hebrew debt slaves who had to be released after 6 years.
Interesting. Well, you can imagine some of the people, and that's a very good point you brought up there, especially the end there in regards to the instructions, what they were to do at the end of every 7 years. What were the Jewish people to do regards to debt once every 7 years? Yeah, they were to forgive it. And so, and you think about it, this, if I understood it correctly, and looking back in Deuteronomy when he talks about this, it wasn't the case of point to where here someone, you loan the fellow the money today, and then 7 years later you released it. It was almost as if that there was a cycle. Every 7 years is when this was done. And so what would happen if that was the case, let's say you were 3 months away from hitting the 7-year mark, you're not going to want to loan the money to somebody because he's only got 3 months to pay it back, and if he doesn't pay it back, then the debt has got to be released. So you can kind of see some of the potential attitudes developing as a result of this. Maybe people were not negligent, but hesitant in loaning money, because of this every 7-year process. Possibly. Any thoughts? Gene?
Well, you're suggesting that it on a strict calendar basis every 7 years, and it would seem to me it might be on an individual basis. If you owe somebody money 7 years from today, you have to forgive that. Doesn't mean there's a calendar date, I don't think.
Well, that's what I was wondering about. When let me see. Let's look over in Deuteronomy 15 for just a moment. Let's see.
17, 7 through 18.
Yeah, and I'll bring it up here on the chart behind me there.
There must be lots of scriptures where I've seen this.
Let's see. Let's look at verse 12 there of Deuteronomy chapter 5 for just a moment there. What did I say? Not chapter 5, chapter 15. Yeah. So notice, let's start here just as a case in point. It goes from 1 to 18 in the whole section here. But it says, if your brother, a Hebrew man, or a Hebrew woman is sold to you and serves you 6 years, then in the 7th year you shall let him go free from you. So that would suggest, like what Gene was talking about there, more not a calendar year, but a specific base, specific
On the individual basis.
individual basis. That's it, yeah. And when you send him away, he shall be free from you. You shall not let him go away empty-handed. You'll supply him liberally from your flock, from your threshing floor, etc., etc. And the reason is, he reminds them that you at one time were slaves in Egypt. And God set you free. Okay. So that's part of what we're looking at here. It's not that every case that Nehemiah is talking about was a slave situation where you were indebted to someone because of what you owed them. But it potentially could have led to that. Let's see. There was something. Any thoughts about that?
Verse 1 talks about the granting release of debts.
Verse 1 does. Let's back up to that. At the end of every 7 years you shall grant a release of debts, and this is the form of the release. Every creditor who has lent anything to his neighbor shall release it. He shall not require it of his neighbor or his brother, because it is called the Lord's release. Of a foreigner you may require it, but you shall give up your claim to what is owed by your brother, except when there may be no poor among you, for the Lord will greatly bless you in the land. Only if you carefully obey the voice of the Lord. So look at verse 1. At the end of every 7 years you shall grant a release of debts. This is what I'm wondering about. If this was calendar year, like remember the crops. Every 7 years you had to let a piece of land rest before planting on it. And if this is every 7 years, then you can see someone being hesitant. If it is from start to finish on an individual basis, then it would you wouldn't have the hesitation to loan someone money, because you know that you had 7 years that you could hold them accountable for it, unless this was a calendar year basis. And the only significance of this is because we're looking at people who didn't have the money. And so they're having to borrow it, and other people are taking advantage of them. Which is so sad, because in taking advantage of them, they were doing no differently than the former generation that had led them to the Babylonian captivity. It's one of the things that they were guilty of. Any thoughts or comments about this, though? Yes, Ms. Phillips.
What you were saying about not wanting to lend as time went on, that's like verse 9.
Yes. There in chapter 5. Yeah. You'll notice there, and we'll come down to this here in just a moment. And I said, what are you doing is not good. Should you not walk in the fear of our God because of the reproach of Nehemiah 5?
Oh, no, in Deuteronomy 15.
Oh, back to where we were at. I'm sorry.
It says specifically, don't say, well, the 7th year's coming up, I don't want to lend to you.
Thank you. Beware lest there be a wicked thought in your heart, saying the 7th year of release is at hand, and your eye be evil against your poor brother, and you give him nothing, and you cry out to the Lord. That was the verse right there. That would put it more on a calendar basis in the lending department. But as far as someone who is working for you because they owe you money as a slave, that was an individual release basis there. Okay.
When Exodus it says if thou buy a Hebrew servant 6 years he shall serve, and in the 7th he shall go free for nothing.
Yes, that puts the slave aspect on it, or the working for on a individual 7-year basis there. And because you think about it, that would do away with the long-term basis of having someone be your slave, so to speak. Once that period of time was up, they were to be released. And they were not to go away empty-handed either. You had to provide for them too. All right, any other thoughts? Okay. All right, let's come back here to Nehemiah now, and let's come back down to verse 4 is where we were discussing there. Another reason why they had done this was because, as we said, they're trying to pay the king's taxes now. But look at verse 5. He says, yet now our flesh is as the flesh of our brethren. Our children as their children. And indeed we are forcing our sons and daughters to be slaves, and some of our daughters have been brought into slavery. So basically what they're saying here is that you've got two groups of people here, in effect. You have one group of people who were the haves, so to speak. And then you had some who were the have-nots, so to speak. And what was happening is they're saying, look, our flesh is as their flesh. We are their people. Our children are as their children. But we here, the have-nots, we are forcing our sons and daughters to be slaves to the haves because of the money that they are loaning us so that we might live. And some of our daughters have been brought into slavery as a result of this. So it is not in our power to redeem them. Because what comes to my mind is some of the little loan places today, where you can go into some little storefront place and borrow $500 from them, and if you're not careful, you're going to owe them $1,500 before everything is said and done. And it's one of those cases where you never can really get ahead. Years ago, many years ago, in our country, there were companies, I guess for lack of a better word, that if you had nowhere else to go, you could go and live within their encampments. And you would work for them. But they charged you for everything. And it was almost like a process to where you could never dig out. Every day that you lived and worked, you got deeper in debt to the company store, so to speak. And that was almost as if what was happening here. They didn't have the money to buy their daughters back, to buy their sons back. They didn't have the money to pay their debts off. It was getting worse and worse and worse. All right, any thoughts or comments? No? Okay. All right.
We ought to learn a lesson from this for ourselves.
Well, that's true. Even on an individual basis of money management.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a good point. Yes, Jeremiah.
Well, I kind of figured out the lesson. Well, what it is, it's kind of like a lesson that it's kind of a simple lesson. Think before you do, and if it doesn't go out good, you have to find a way to pay it off.
That's a good point. You'll pay the bills next month, son. That's right. But that's right. You think before you do.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Jeremiah.
How many times have you heard that one?
That's a good point. All righty. Any other thoughts? All right, let's come down now to verse number 6 there. And Miss Wilma, would you mind reading for us there, beginning in verse 6? And let's read down through verse, let's go 6, 7, and 8. We'll break this up a little bit more here.
And I became very angry when I heard their outcry and these words. After serious thought, I rebuked the nobles and rulers and said to them, each of you is exacting usury from his brother. So I called a great assembly against them, and I said to them, according to our ability, we have redeemed our Jewish brethren who were sold to the nations. Now indeed, will you ever sell your brethren, or shall they be sold to us, that they were silent and found nothing to say?
Okay. There we go. All right, let's talk about this one for a minute. A couple things here within this particular text we need to consider. What was Nehemiah's reaction? He was angry. Exactly. And there's a couple more verses we want to look at here in just a minute to show how egregious their sins were against one another. But he says there in verse 7, after serious thought, who did he rebuke? Yeah, he rebuked the nobles. Because who were the guilty ones? Who were the ones that were loaning and then charging interest and treating these people this way?
The rulers.
The rulers were, exactly, those who were the haves. And so he rebuked the rulers. He rebuked the nobles. And notice what he says to them. He says, each of you is exacting usury from his brother. Now, let's talk about that for a moment. I mentioned earlier that during the days leading up to the Babylonian captivity, part of the reason that they went into captivity was the way that they were treating one another. In Amos chapter 2, verses 6 through 8, let's jump over there for just a moment there. And in Amos chapter 2, and let's note there in verses 6 through 8, that Ammonius, wow, where did that come from? Amos says, thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Israel, and for 4 I will not turn away its punishment, because they sell the righteous for silver, and the poor for a pair of sandals. They pant after the dust of the earth, which is on the head of the poor, and pervert the way of the humble. A man and his father go in to the same girl to defile my holy name. They lie down by every altar on clothes taken in pledge, and drink the wine of the condemned in the house of their God. So this is what they were doing. The northern nation was doing it, and the southern nation became guilty of the same thing there. Now, what is the concept of exacting usury? What is he talking about here? All right. He's talking about a type of interest there. Notice with me in Deuteronomy chapter 23 there, and let's look at 19 and 20 for just a moment. Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 19 and 20. Now we're jumping into the middle of some of these sections here clearly, but he makes a statement here, you shall not charge interest to your brother, interest on money or food or anything that is lent out at interest. To a foreigner you may charge interest, but to your brother you shall not charge interest. For the Lord your God may bless you in all to which you set your hand in the land which you are entering to possess. So how much interest were they allowed to charge? None. None. Okay.
If you go to Deuteronomy, the 15th chapter, verse 2, it mentions that this is the Lord's release.
Yes.
And this is why Nehemiah got so angry, is because what they were doing was contrary to God's law.
That's right. It wasn't a simple case of not cutting your brethren some slack. This was disobedience. Disobedience. And again, here we have a people that God has delivered them out of captivity. And this is just another instance of where they stray from following His word. Mm-hmm. Any thoughts?
Yeah. He talks here about usurious interest on loans was not forbidden, because in one of Christ's examples in the three of the unfaithful servant, he had one, you should have taken my money and put it to the bankers for interest.
Okay.
I would have had that and more when I came back. So interest on loans was not forbidden. It was the kind of thing he's talking about. Usurious loans against your brother.
Against your brother there. Where it's essentially what you're looking at is where they are in need and you're helping them with what they have need of. And on top of what you're giving them, it's not simply a repay back, but it's a repay back plus. Yeah. Any thoughts? All right, now.
God has always wanted His people to be a people of compassion for one another.
Well, He has. I mean, you go all the way back and look at the process of gleaning in the fields there. It was all about those who had being willing to help those who did not have.
We should never look at our brethren and say, how can I make money off of them, or how can I benefit from our relationship in such a way, financially, whatever. We've seen, you and I saw the gentleman that came from a different congregation while we lived in McAllister, who was there only to campaign, because he was running for something in the city council. He wasn't there because he wanted to worship God. He was there to schmooze with the brethren to try to get us to vote for him or whatever. And that's not our purpose. We lose focus on what our whole purpose. Our purpose is to be like Jesus, to help those find salvation. And then if we have the ability, we're taught in the New Testament, the whole reason we work is to help those who are in need. We're not supposed to be looking for opportunities to pat our...
Well, that's what Paul says in Ephesians chapter 4. Let him who stole still no longer, but rather let him labor with his hands that he may give to those who do not have. Now, this isn't releasing individuals of responsibility to work. It's just putting upon the faithful the responsibility when they have the opportunity and the means to render assistance as they can.
So that's the example of Ruth in the fields of Boaz.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And even he was instructing his people to leave gleanings for her to pick up.
To leave extra, to drop extra, yeah. That's exactly right. Well, and that was part of the gleaning law. If you were plowing your fields and you dropped some stuff, you could not pick it up. Because it had to be left for those who were going to come and glean the fields. Yeah. All right.
The last part there, so I called a great assembly against them.
Mm-hmm.
Pyle says it like this: I resolved to shame them out of their scandalous proceeding in an open assembly of magistrates and people, which I meekly called for that purpose. That's similar to what we talked about when people are disorderly, is marking them.
That's a good point there. In a public manner, identifying this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They had nothing to say.
That's right.
But he charged them with.
Well, the thing is, they knew that he was right. Yeah. They knew that he was right. Okay. What is interesting about these things is this is just what Nehemiah was addressing. We don't see Ezra in any part of this. We don't know where Ezra's at this moment, what Ezra's doing. Right now, this is from Nehemiah's perspective and what Nehemiah is addressing here. Look there in verse 8. We looked at this a while ago. He said, and I said to them, according to our ability, we have redeemed our Jewish brethren who were sold to the nations. In other words, we've been bought back. God has brought us back. Now indeed, will you even sell your brethren, or should they be sold to us? You know, what is this? God delivered us. Now here we are selling one another into slavery. Then they were silenced, and as Dale pointed out, and found nothing to say. Any thoughts or comments about that? Okay, let's continue here with our reading, or anything? Miss Retha, let's come to you, and if you would please read for us, beginning in verse 9, and let's read 9, 10, and 11.
Then I said, what you are doing is not good. Should you not walk in the fear of our God because of the reproach of the nations, our enemies? I also, with my brethren and my servants, am lending them money and grain. Please let us stop this usury. Restore now to them, even this day, their lands, their vineyards, their olive groves, and their houses. Also 100th of the money and the grain, the new wine and the oil that you have charged them.
Okay, let's come back here to verse 9 now. And look at what Nehemiah says that he is going to do to help the people out there. He says, first off, what you're doing, of course, is not good. Should you not walk in the fear of our God because of the reproach of the nations, our enemies? Think about this for a minute. How would this look to the surrounding nations when these people accredit their deliverance from the Babylonian captivity and return to the homeland to God, but yet they in turn are selling each other into slavery?
They show no difference than the people that were already there.
Exactly. There's no difference. And so as a result, it would bring reproach upon the nations. Or as a result, it would bring reproach from the nations upon the nation of God. There, David was guilty of this with his sin with Bathsheba. It's one of the reasons why the baby died, because he brought reproach upon the nation of God. And so his solution there in verse 10, he says, I also with my brethren and my servants am lending them money and grain. All right, Nehemiah, he is going to step in, and he says that I am lending them money and grain, but let us stop this usury. There wasn't anything wrong with lending them the money and the grain, but doing it in such a way that would keep them continually indebted was against the will of the Lord. So he says in verse 11, to restore now to them even this day their lands. Give it back to them. Give them their vineyards. Give them their olive groves and their houses. Also 100th of the money and the grain, the new wine and the oil that you have charged them. So he's telling them, give them back their homes and their lands and their vineyards and their olive groves, in addition to 100th of the money and the grain.
So you said you pay them interest on what you're taking from them.
That's it. Exactly. You pay them interest on what you've taken from them. Because you think about what happens if you go in and you take their lands and their vineyards and their olive groves. They can't work. You know, and so they're just continually in the indebted process. Right.
As I say, when you read this, you see such the call of God to his people to live so differently than the world lives.
Yes.
In the New Testament, they think it's strange that we don't run to the same excessive riot and just well, I can say the word, but
dispensation or something.
Dissipation.
Dissipation, that's it. 1 Peter 4.
God has always called his people to live above the world's standards.
Yes.
To so shine that they know that you are God's people. That was his call from when he started the Hebrew nation, and that's his call for us today, is to live so differently than the world that they can't help but see
That's right.
Christ living in you.
Let his people set the example for the world, not the world become the example for his people. Yeah.
They see God through us, and we sometimes give them an awful bad picture.
They do. That's exactly right. Jeremiah.
Well, okay, this is what I was kind of thinking about the lesson is God, he didn't actually not just start it with the Hebrews. He started it from all the way to the Old Testament and to now. He's been keeping his plan for a long time, and the people who choose to follow it are the ones that follow it for their whole entire life, are the ones who get to go to heaven.
That's right. That's exactly right. It wasn't just for the Hebrews. It was for all who would follow him. That's right. Any other thoughts or comments? Any from his older siblings?
Like Hannah.
Okay. All righty. Well, let's continue here. And that's very, very true, Jeremiah. Very true. All right. As we continue this, let's start there in verse 12. And Sister Edna Mae, would you mind reading for us beginning in verse 12? And let's read verses 12 and 13, please.
Thank you, brother, for getting the name right.
Well, I used your first name, not your last name. That's what got me right there.
I noticed that. Okay, so they said, we will restore it and will require nothing from them. We will do as you say. Then I called the priests and require an oath from them that they would do according to this promise. Then I shook out the fold of my garment and said, so may God shake out each man from his house and from his property who does not perform this promise. Even thus may he be shaken out and emptied. And all the assembly said, Amen, and praised the Lord. Then the people did according to this promise.
Okay, I tried to make the screen a little more fluid there and put it jumping on you like that. Okay, let's look at verse 12 here for just a moment there. Here was their reply. We will restore it. And on top of that, we will require nothing of them. In other words, it reads as if we're canceling all the debts. Okay, we will do as you say. Then I called the priest, and he required an oath from them to make certain that they would do according to that promise there. But then in verse 13, one of the beauties about the Old Testament are the symbolic gestures that they used back then. We don't have, at least I don't think, in our culture, too many symbolic gestures unless it's hand movements, whenever we talk or so forth. But what he did was he took the fold of his garment and he shook it. Shook the fold of his garment. And that was symbolic of what he was about to say. So may God shake out each man from his house and from his property who does not do what? Perform this promise. Even thus may be shaken out and emptied. So what was the reply of the people, of the whole multitude that was there?
Amen.
That's right. Amen. They fully agreed with what Nehemiah was saying. They fully committed to it. They praised the Lord. Then the people did according to this promise. Now this shows us people can repent. It shows us that people can change, doesn't it? But, as with the history of this people, we see so many times where for the moment they are moved to some sort of repentance, and then a number of years later something else comes up, some other transgression. Who does that remind you of today? Us, if we're not careful. Exactly. Any thoughts or comments?
Well, if you think about the whole process, these people have been living with the heathens of the world for quite some time. They've picked up some of the habits of the heathens and everything. Now they're coming to their land, and
That's true.
they're still used to doing some of the things here. It's a lack of knowledge in some ways because some of these folks have never been to their land.
Right.
Now they're coming in there, and Nehemiah is having to correct them and let them know that what they're doing is the way of the heathens. It's not the way of God, and you need to repent.
That's a very good point. By this time, they had probably already been in the land nearly some 70 years, which would definitely have brought forth children and grandchildren who had been raised, who had not seen the Babylonian captivity, who had not been taught prior to that. And that's a very good point. They were still in the learning process. Any thought, Gene?
Yeah, this symbolism that you talk about, I think you saw it one time during Christ's ministry, where he was giving his apostles instructions that if you go to a village and they will not accept you, shake off the dust of your garments against the village.
Yeah.
So that was a mark of insult.
Exactly.
Against the village.
Jehovah's Witnesses supposedly will do that today. My thoughts are, we've got a battery-operated blower. The next time I tell them we're not interested in studying, here, hold your feet up, let me help you out in that process. Sorry. But that's right, it's a symbolic process. Even when Jesus drew on the ground, remember that one instance when he was waiting to see what the men were going to say in regards to the woman caught in adultery? Some speculated he might have been writing a verse or writing some sort of Hebrew letters to kind of bring to their remembrance what he was talking about. Yeah.
I much prefer to take them out to the garden hose myself.
The garden. Here, let me just wash those feet off. But see, and this is one of the things that was very time specific. Because what commission were they being sent on where they were told to knock the dust off their feet?
The Great Commission.
It was limited commission, actually.
Limited.
Yeah.
Oh,
when they were sent out in groups, and when they sent 70 of them out in pairs, and the apostles. And this was extremely important because what they were trying to teach the people were about Jesus Christ. Our day and time, we're a little bit different. I don't believe the command to knock the dust off your feet is to us today. It just shows, and this was for the whole city. All right, if you don't want them, we'll go to someone else. Our responsibility has been fulfilled. We will take it somewhere else there.
But now, we also have the statement, don't cast your pearls before swine. We have to realize that if someone is completely not going to be willing to accept it at this time, to go on and pray for that person that they might eventually see it, but go to someone else that might accept it too.
That's right. That's right. There's a fine line between trying to determine who is just not getting it yet and who is outright stubborn and rejecting it. The thing is, can we make those decisions based on appearance? No. It's experience with the individual. Yeah. And like you said, even then, we still pray for them. We don't chalk them up to being a lost cause, but we put them in the hands of God, and hopefully someone else can have greater success in watering the seed that's been planted. All right, any thoughts?
It seems as though this was not taken lightly, but I wonder what entails shaken out and emptied.
As far as in what he did with his garment, or with what the warning here?
Yeah, the warning.
Well, essentially, what it kind of suggests there is that, in other words, if a particular person was unwilling to treat his brother and release him from the debt, then God would hold that person accountable, and he would give up his house and his lands and his properties. So if you have someone who was unwilling to do what Nehemiah said, then basically let him be treated this way, and let him no longer have anything. And you might see it as whatever he has, let it be given to these people in full. But I think that's the warning there, that he would lose everything if he was unwilling to release the Jews from their debt.
Because they really took it serious and they were obedient.
Absolutely. That's exactly right.
This was nothing funny.
Yeah.
Almost in this, there's implicitly a statement that says, if you don't do this, you'll have no part with us ever God.
That's right.
You're through.
Exactly.
Cut off. You're
Exactly.
You're shaken out and empty, which is cut off.
That's right. Completely cut off. And this goes back to what we read about in the New Testament. You reap what you what? So, exactly. And we should do for others as we would want done for us. Exactly.
It seemed like so many take that lightly.
Yeah, not before they do it too. That's right. All right, Jeremiah.
It's the golden rule.
Thank you. It's the golden rule. That's right. Okay, someone's been listening to Bible class, hasn't he? Okay. All right, let's start now with verse 14. We've got a few minutes remaining here in our study today. So start in verse 14 there, and Brother Gene, would you mind reading for us, beginning of verse 14, and let's do 14, 15, and 16, please.
Okay. Moreover, from the time that I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year even unto 2 and 30 and 13th year of Artaxerxes the king, that is 12 years, I and my brethren have not eaten the bread of the governor. But the former governors that had been before me were chargeable unto the people, and have taken of their bread and wine, beside 40 shekels of silver. Yea, even their servants bear rule over the people, but so did not I, because of the fear of God. Yea, also I continued in the work of the wall, neither brought we any land. All my servants were gathered thither of the work.
Okay. And Ms. Doris, would you mind finishing up 17 and 18 there?
Oh, chapter 5. I was in the wrong one. And at my table were 150 Jews and rulers, besides those who came to us from the nations around us. Now that which was prepared daily was 1 ox and 6 choice sheep. They'll be eating for how long? Anyway, also fowl were prepared for me, and once every 10 days, an abundance of all kinds of wine. Yet in spite of this, I did not demand the governor's provisions, because the bondage was heavy on this people.
Okay. And let's see. Janessa, you want to read that last verse for us at verse 19?
Sure. Remember me, my God, for good according to all that I have done for these people.
Okay. All right, let's come back up here. Just a couple of thoughts before we pull the class to a close there. We come up to verse 14 with this. We find that and here's what Nehemiah, what he has done. He says, from the time that I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year until the 32nd year, 12 years now. All right, 12 years. He says, neither I nor my brothers ate the what? Governor's provision. The governor had the right, by law at least, to pull extra from the people for him. You know, they had the provisions for what they had to pay the Persian people, or the Persian kingdoms, and they had a certain amount that they could pull. And so the governor wanted to charge extra, he could. But Nehemiah says, I did not do this. He was not going to be a source of problem or issue upon the livelihood of the people there. But the former governors, they had laid burdens on the people. They had taken from the bread and the wine besides 40 shekels of silver. Yes, even their servants bore rule over the people. You know, think about it. You know, with the governor, he's got to get paid, and his wife's got to get paid, and their servants got to get paid. You know, and so if you're just within the governor's household, you get to pull your part from the money. And so this was a heavy burden upon the people. And you think about this, part of this time period, I go back to what Miss Maxine said earlier, or Miss Ford said earlier, part of this time period, they were having to build a wall. You know, so we're looking at a lot that's going on within this process here. So he says, I did not do it for what reason? Yeah, exactly. Because as Dale pointed out a while ago, this was a matter of law, of the way that he needed to treat his people or God's people. So verse 16, he says, I also continued the work on this wall, and we did not buy any land. All my servants were gathered there for the work. We were all part of this process. And at my table, you know, and this, Miss Doris is right, this seems like a lot. But really, he's showing them how little that his household there would normally partake. And at my table, 150 Jews and rulers, besides those who came to us from other nations. And so what they ate daily was what they needed to eat. No more. We're not looking at gluttony. We're not looking at indulgence in excess there. By the way, what's a fowl? A bird, yeah. So you can say a bird is a foul animal. Or a turkey. Yeah, that's right. And the bird, well, never mind. And look right here, there. Sorry, stop that. And once every 10 days, an abundance of all kinds of wine. Yet in spite of this, he says, I did not demand what? The governor's provisions, exactly. Because the bondage was heavy upon the people. Gene.
Yeah, there's another part of that, I think, where it says that even servants bear rule over the people. I think the arrogance of the rulers and the overbearing that was extended to the servants, they exerted rule over the people, apart from the governor, I think.
Yeah, that's what it reads.
Yeah.
Exactly. They let it go to their heads. You know, you give someone a little bit of power and they think you've given them the rule of the world type thing. And so the previous servants were extracting their own taxes from the people, for lack of a better way. Any thoughts about that?
If you look at verse 17, he says that at my table were 150 Jews and rulers, besides those who came to us from the nations around us, which suggests that Nehemiah kind of had an open house, that he entertained anybody who came in. Now the question is, with all this food and everything, where did the money come from?
Well, there was a part of it that had to come from the people.
Maybe.
A certain portion.
Maybe.
Yeah. But
The other thought is, some of the commentaries suggest that when Nehemiah was a cupbearer for the king, that he managed to save money. And so he did not extract money from anyone, as the former governors had done. Nehemiah used his own money to provide the food and the comfort for the visitors.
you know, doing that for 12 years would require an extensive amount of resources. Yeah, I've read some that suggest that he did pull taxes from the people, but only that which was sufficient to enable him to function, but not like the others had done in overburdening. So it could be either way there, because he would have been well supported as a cupbearer. And not only that, but think about all the provisions he had been given from King Artaxerxes when he came over too. So a lot of what he was pulling could have come from that. The king may have had his own livestock that he raised, or his servants raised and grew and produced and everything, instead of living extensively off the people there. Let's see, one more verse here, and then we're going to talk about coming up here in April there. Notice here the final verse, verse 19. Remember me, my God, for good, according to all that I have done for this people. Nehemiah is not bragging, but he's just stating this is what he had done, and prayed the Lord that the Lord would remember him. All right. Any thoughts or comments?
Nehemiah is a good example of what a man, a woman of God will do. If your heart is right and you want to obey God, you will obey His command. And I think Nehemiah is an example of that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. Yes, Jeremiah?
Well, there is
Speak up.
there is just one thing I kind of wanted to say. Well, there are a couple lessons you can learn from this, but the main important one is that the one that I was thinking of that I kind of wanted to do is if you know God, do not brag about it. If you believe in God, do not brag.
It's an interesting point. We don't brag about our service for God, but we do thank God for being with us and enabling us to do what we do there. Okay. Any other thoughts on that? All right, we'll plan to do the questions next week. What I want to talk to you about is coming up in the month of April there. I think last year we had stopped at the end of March, but we're currently on chapter 5 of Nehemiah, and we have about 8 more chapters left. If we continue through April, starting with the 27th, we're going to have a total of 4 class periods, because I'll be away for a meeting on April the 17th, I believe it is. April 17th, which is a Tuesday. Now, even with that, I'm not positive we can get through the end of Nehemiah unless we kind of double up on a week or two. So, what would your preference be? Would you all want to go ahead and meet through April to see if we can conclude our Nehemiah study, or pick up where we leave off if we stopped it at the end of March, pick it up this fall? Any thoughts? Any other preference? I would ask Miss Retha, but that's kind of it's kind of
Retha, will you be back each Tuesday?
she'll rejoin us later. You know, she'll come back
I might
and
try to
visit us.
pick you up. No, I'm not.
Yeah, you could. Yeah, it'd be if you're awake, it'll be 8:00 California time.
You're the teacher, you decide.
Well, like I said, I have mixed feelings on it because we are far enough out that if we held off until the fall, we'd have about half of Nehemiah left to study. If we could manage to get it finished by the end of April, then we could start a different study. We just think, just go ahead and wait.
No, I think you won't be able to finish.
We won't.
Nehemiah,
Oh.
no.
Realistically?
Yeah. Okay.
Not
then-
get it finished.
Yeah.
I'll tell you that.
And so we'll still have to resume it anyway. So let's go ahead and plan. The reason why I'm saying that, it'll give us something of substance to continue with in the fall. You know, if we try to get it done and we're 2 chapters short, then when we start up, we'll have to do a good bit of review just for 2 chapters, and then we'll start something else. So let's plan. I think we got one more Tuesday after today, and then we'll pause the study through the summer, and then we'll resume back this fall with wherever we leave off next week. Any thoughts or comments about that?
I guess that's good since I made it announced to Sunday that it only goes through one.
Well, you've been wrong before, so I mean, that'd be all right.
Obviously.
Any thoughts? Okay, all right. Well, let's plan next Tuesday morning. We'll do the questions for chapter 5 and step into chapter 6. Any other thoughts or comments? If not, let's go ahead and be dismissed. And I'll ask Gene, if you would, to dismiss us in a word of prayer.
Our gracious Lord, we thank Thee that we've been able to come together as thy children to study from thy holy word, to learn the dealings that thou hast had with thy children through the years and through the times, and learn from them the lessons that are applicable to us today. We pray that thou would forgive our sins, bless us as we leave, bring us back the next hour. In the name of thy Son, Jesus Christ, we pray.
Amen.
Amen.